Hey guys, tonight we are walking into a cozy little English town where the streets smell like rain on limestone and the birds gossip louder than the neighbors. You're just here to visit family, maybe grab a cup of tea, sneak in a nap, pretend you like scones, but before the kettle even finishes boiling, you'll stumble on something so bone-deep awful it'll shake the entire town. A body at a desk. A trickle of blood soaking into old paper, and the silence of a flat that should have been clinking with china and muttered critiques of modern grammar. You probably won't survive this nap with your innocence intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it over there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up to the sound of your own breath. The flat's quiet, too quiet for a Tuesday in May. Something's off, and you feel it in your stomach. Like milk gone sour. You shuffle to the window, blink past the late spring drizzle, and spot the usual morning paper. But it's still sitting outside your mom's door. That's not like Eleanor. She's never late for the paper, or the post, or anything. Really, this is a woman who used to correct your teacher's spelling errors in Latin. You hesitate. Maybe she overslept. You don't want to seem paranoid, so you do what any British son in denial might. You go grocery shopping. It's a forgettable blur mill. Eggs, the wrong kind of biscuits. But the cloud in your mind keeps thickening. By noon, your phone stays silent. No. Eleanor knocking with a plate of sandwiches she accidentally made too many of. No lunch, no mother. So you climb the stairs. Your feet feel like bricks as you reach the third floor. Her door is closed. You knock. Nothing. Knock again. Still nothing. You fish out the spare key from under that ceramic goose she insists is charming, and your fingers tremble as it clicks. Inside, the flat is neat as ever, books in perfect order, curtains tied just right, but the air is too still. You call her name once, twice. Your voice sounds wrong in here, like it's trespassing. Then, you see her. She's at her desk, hunched, like she's just fallen asleep mid-sentence. But the way her head tilts isn't peaceful. It's broken. There's blood, a lot of it pooling under her chair and soaking into the old Turkish rug she loved. You don't remember screaming, but your throat aches. You don't remember grabbing the phone, but you're already sobbing into the receiver, trying to say the word mum through 1,000 other words that don't help. The paramedics come quickly, followed by the police. You just sit on the stairs, eyes wide, shaking, repeating the same 6 sentences over and over. She was fine yesterday. She was coming to lunch. She never misses lunch. They ask about the door. You tell them it wasn't forced. They nod. They note it down. One officer leans close and asks gently if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt her. You blink. Eleanor. Hurt. She was a historian, a writer. Her greatest enemy was poor punctuation. But then you remember last week's argument. You'd begged her to keep supporting you financially. She said something about needing to cut the rope before you both drowned. Your heart sinks. Forensics take over. They find a bloody gavel, a heavy, old thing you'd once used in court before your career collapsed. They find no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. They do find a single strand of long, dark hair in her hand. Not yours. Yours is short, light brown, and currently falling out thanks to stress. They also find a smudged fingerprint on the fridge reddish, like it had been left by someone in a hurry. Not yours. Again, still, the police keep circling you. You live 1 floor below. You invited her to lunch. You have a key. And the press. Oh, the press eats it alive. Historian found murdered in her flat. Son last to see her alive. Family feud at the heart of local tragedy. You want to scream, but instead, you drink again and again, just to sleep, just to forget, and the world keeps moving. Historically, the early 1980s in England weren't known for their sensitivity to mental health or nuanced identities. It was the same decade when Margaret Thatcher famously declared that children are being taught they have an inalienable right to be gay, which gives you a pretty good idea of how society viewed people like Thomas successful. Yes, but gay, and therefore constantly swimming upstream in a system built on repression. Oddly enough, Victorian mourning customs make more sense to you now. In the 1800s, families would cover mirrors with black cloths, stop clocks at the moment of death, and even take mourning portraits of the deceased. Strange as it sounds, those rituals helped the living carry grief with structure. Now, you just sit in your flat, surrounded by silence and accusations, and try to remember how your mother used to hum when she watered the violets on her windowsill. Historians still argue whether Eleanor Wakefield's murder was a classic crime of passion or something colder, calculated, timed, inevitable. But that's not your question tonight. You're still stuck on something smaller, meaner, more personal. Why didn't she come to lunch? You never really asked to be born into prestige, did you? That was your mother's arena. Eleanor Wakefield, woman of intellect, historical insight, and passive-aggressive Christmas cards. She published books with footnotes longer than most thrillers, and could name the Plantagenet line backward if she had a glass of sherry. To the outside world, she was brilliance in human form. But to you, she was pressure on toast. The Wakefields weren't just respected, they were institutionally intimidating. The sort of family that made small talk about 17th century trade laws and corrected the Latin on church gravestones. Eleanor's husband, your father, had been a judge. When he died young, she didn't fall apart. She just pulled the curtains closed for a week, updated her resume, and went right back to giving lectures on the misuse of medieval mercy. So yeah, expectations. Let's just say there was no room for C's on your report card from the beginning. She crafted your path like a historical narrative, clean, structured, and with no room for deviation. You were the golden child, sharp, charming, annoyingly fluent in Shakespearean insults by the time you were 11. She told her friends that you would either be a barrister or a bishop by 25. And for a while, it looked like she was right. You crushed exams, got into Durham, wore your confidence like armor, and when you became one of the youngest Crown prosecutors in North Yorkshire, she cried, but only briefly, because she had a press release to draft. But success, as it turns out, isn't the same as peace in private. You were suffocating. There was no space to breathe, to be different, to be flawed, especially not to be gay, not in your circles, not in your chambers, and certainly not with a mother who still referred to it as that unfortunate inclination. You remember the way she pursed her lips the first time she saw you with your partner. She said nothing, but then she rarely had to. Eleanor's silences were weaponized. You hid, you drank, you laughed a little too loud at parties and stayed a little too late at work. And when the pressure finally cracked you like an old vase, it was public. A humiliating ethics complaint, a disciplinary hearing, and the slow, grinding loss of everything you'd built. She didn't abandon you, not quite, but she never let you forget. Even after you moved into the flat beneath hers just 2 floors apart, yet separated by centuries of judgment. Every visit felt like parole. She'd bring soup, then slip in a comment about your potential being squandered. She offered rent money, then cut it short when you bought wine. She gave you affection, then snatched it back if you showed weakness. And yet, in some twisted way, you still loved her. Or maybe you loved the version of her you'd always hoped would show up. The warm, nurturing Eleanor who never quite existed, but who lived rent-free in your imagination. You still invited her to lunch, still sent her those awful world's best mum mugs, still tried, even on the day before she died. You'd hope the conversation would be different. But of course it wasn't. That day, you remember setting the table like it was a performance. Napkins folded, glasses sparkling, something vaguely Italian on the stove. Anything to distract from the truth. You hoped for an olive branch. What you got was a reality check. She knocked precisely at noon. You buzzed her in, and when she entered, you saw the little flicker of disapproval. Your hair was too long, your shirt too loud, your eyes too tired. She gave you a quick once-over, then kissed your cheek with the enthusiasm of a tax auditor. The meal was pleasant, in the way Victorian funerals are pleasant, structured, quiet, and full of implied grief. You told her you were applying for jobs. She raised an eyebrow. You said you were cutting back on drinking. She sniffed the wine glass and changed the subject. Then she said the words you'd been dreading. I can't keep funding your delusion. Thomas, if you want to rebuild your life, you'll do it on your own. It was a clean blow, wrapped in civility, like all her sentences. She didn't scream, she didn't threaten. She just looked at you like you were a historical disappointment, a footnote in the wrong chapter, and then she left, telling you to return the gavel she'd borrowed from your old office. You'd been using it as a paperweight. You watched her go, stared at your pasta, and wondered how things had gotten this far. But what you didn't know, what no one knew, was that you weren't the only Wakefield child stewing in that flat that day. There was someone else. Someone who, unlike you, hadn't learned to manage pain with words and sarcasm. You'd grown up beside her, even if she wasn't blood. You'd called her your sister once. But the truth was, she'd been quietly erased long before either of you reached adulthood. Her name was Isabel, and history had a way of forgetting her. Quirky side note, the Wakefields, ever obsessed with reputation, once had a family crest embroidered with an owl and the Latin motto Silentium potestatem est silence, is power, which is ironic, considering how many secrets were hiding in their elegant little household. Historians still argue whether the Wakefield legacy was a shining example of British intellect or just another gilded cage. Either way, it didn't end well. And as you sat in your flat that night, staring up at the ceiling where your mother's body still waited for the coroner, you had no idea that her death was about to tear open a story far messier than you imagined. You knew it wasn't your fault, or at least, that's what you told yourself in the quiet hours between midnight and guilt. Still, the suspicion clung to you like the damp chill of an English cellar, always there, always just under the skin. The neighbors wouldn't meet your eye. The postman stopped making small talk. Even the woman from the bakery down the street, who used to slip you extra scones, started pretending not to see you. The worst part? You didn't even blame them. Because from the outside, it looked bad. Really bad. There you were, Thomas Wakefield, once the pride of North Yorkshire's Crown Court, now a man with trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes, living beneath the flat where his mother had been brutally murdered. Alone. Unemployed, estranged from nearly everyone who'd ever mattered. You were the golden boy gone wrong, and small towns never forget a golden boy who burns out. They remembered your successes like they were their own, your university articles, your sharp-witted TV interviews, even that one time you prosecuted a minor celebrity for tax fraud. But now you were the headline they whispered over coffee. Wakefield, son questioned again in mother's death. Because, of course, they questioned you over and over, each time gentler, but more resigned, as if they were trying to find new ways to get you to admit something they were sure you'd done. You told them the truth, every time. You invited her to lunch. You didn't go upstairs again. You didn't hear anything. You didn't kill her. The evidence didn't point to you. No forced entry, a hair that wasn't yours, a reddish fingerprint that didn't match. But even evidence gets blurry when a town decides on its villain, and you had given them ammo. Your fall had been loud, messy, and deeply public. They knew about the drinking. That came out during the ethics hearing. They knew about the partner who left, some still whispered about him like he'd been a shadowy influence, a kind of stylish deviant who lured you off the straight and narrow. They even knew about that fight you had with Eleanor at the bookstore last December, the one where she'd slapped your hand away from a bottle of wine and hissed, "You're not even trying anymore." Of course, they didn't see what came before the fall. They didn't see the long nights you'd spent in court, building airtight cases that put bad people behind bars. They didn't see the quiet ways you'd tried to support Eleanor, setting up her first email account, editing her manuscripts, organizing her book launches when her arthritis flared. They didn't see how much you wanted her approval, or how rarely you got it. She once called your courtroom work flamboyant. You don't think she meant it as a compliment. So, when the whispers started, when the tabloids described you as volatile, when former colleagues spoke in carefully measured phrases, when even the officer you trusted most began to hesitate, you did the only thing you knew how to do. You shut down. You stopped answering calls. You pulled the blinds. You walked through town like a ghost, your shoulders hunched, your gaze fixed on the cracks in the pavement. You let the world think what it wanted, and deep down, you started to think it too. That maybe you weren't guilty, but you were responsible. Because if you had just done better, just been stronger, maybe she wouldn't have felt the need to threaten you. Maybe she wouldn't have snapped. Maybe none of it would have happened. It's an old trick of grief to carve the word maybe into every memory. And while you spiraled, the case froze. There were no new leads, no confessions, no further evidence. The gavel was cleaned and stored. The bloody fingerprint stayed unmatched. The strand of hair was filed away in a plastic bag labeled unknown female. And life just moved on. You didn't. You started drinking earlier in the day. You stopped eating properly. Your rent checks bounced. Your hands shook too much to type. So you abandoned job applications halfway through. At night, you would lie on the floor with a pillow over your face, hoping to muffle the sobs that came without warning. You weren't sleeping. You weren't living. You were waiting for what? You didn't know. Oddly, this is where you learn a strange piece of history. In medieval England, wakefields were literal fields where families would sit in vigil beside the dead. They'd hold candles, say prayers, sometimes sing songs. The point was to honor the departed, but also to protect their soul from spirits trying to claim them. Your flat had become your wakefield, but the only spirit haunting it was yours. Historians still argue whether Thomas Wakefield's descent was a symptom of personal weakness or societal cruelty. Whether he drank himself to death out of guilt or because the world gave him nothing to live for. The official story ends in March 1985, when paramedics found you collapsed on your kitchen floor. Liver failure, cirrhosis. You were 41. The obituary was short, clinical, and full of half-truths. It didn't mention the rage you swallowed, the pain you masked, the shame you wore like a coat you couldn't take off. It didn't mention that your mother once read your first legal brief and said, "You're not bad. You know, you might actually make something of yourself." It didn't mention how badly you needed to hear that again. It also didn't mention Isabel, because no one even knew to ask. It's funny, in a cruel way, how something as harmless as a lunch invitation can end up echoing through courtrooms, autopsy reports, and late-night radio segments about unsolved English tragedies. But that day, the day before everything shattered, wasn't just about the pasta, or the gavel, or even the tension that always simmered beneath your mother's carefully powdered exterior. It was about two people sitting at a table, pretending to be family. You'd spent the morning cleaning, not obsessively, but with the quiet hope that maybe, if the place looked nice, the conversation might follow suit. You straightened the couch cushions, wiped fingerprints off the mirror, and even arranged fresh flowers, a rare gesture. Since your relationship with plants mirrored your relationship with Eleanor, brief, brittle, and usually ending in something wilted. By noon, the pasta was boiling. The wine was uncorked. You'd set two places. Eleanor always preferred the chair closest to the window, where she could judge the world in natural light. She arrived right on time. As always, not a minute early, not a minute late. There was a chill in her smile, not enough to start a fight, just enough to let you know she wasn't planning on staying long. You kissed her cheek in automatic, brittle gesture and ushered her inside. She commented on the flowers, said nothing about the dishes, then glanced at the wine and arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "You're drinking again." It wasn't a question. You said it was just for lunch. She nodded, which somehow felt more judgmental than a scolding. Then she sat down, pulled her napkin into her lap like a coronation ceremony, and waited. The meal was technically fine. The pasta wasn't overcooked, and the sauce didn't offend her. But the air was thick with unfinished conversations. You tried. You really did. You told her you'd signed up for a workshop, that you were applying for a legal adjacent job in Leeds. You mentioned a writing project, something about wrongful convictions and prosecutorial ethics. She didn't blink, just took another bite. Then she sighed. "Thomas, you know I've supported you as long as I could, but this isn't support anymore. It's enabling." You froze. "I want to believe you'll rebuild, but I can't keep pouring resources into a well with no bottom. You need to stand up or stay down. I won't prop you up again." And there it was, the slap without a sound. You wanted to shout or cry or just disappear into your chair, but you nodded, bit your tongue, said thank you, somehow, for the advice. She rose not long after, placing her napkin gently on the table like she was tucking in a child. On her way out, she paused at the shelf near the door. There, in a small glass case, sat the ceremonial gavel from your prosecutorial days. A gift from your first team after a big trial win. Eleanor had asked to borrow it months ago for a lecture on modern justice. You'd forgotten it was even still in her flat. She glanced at it, then back at you. "I'll return this tomorrow. It belongs with you now." Then she left. The door clicked shut. Her scent, that lavender and parchment blend, lingered just long enough to break your heart. You sat alone for a long time after. The pasta dried on the plates. The wine turned bitter. And outside, the sky darkened like it knew something was ending. You never saw her alive again. It's worth noting here that Victorian etiquette manuals, yes, they existed, warned strongly against airing familial grievances at the dinner table. Apparently, it unsettled digestion and weakened the bonds of civility. You imagine Eleanor would have found that quaintly accurate. Historians still argue whether Eleanor was trying to help or simply delivering a final, icy verdict. Maybe it was both. Maybe she believed in tough love. Maybe she thought rock bottom would force you to rise. She wouldn't live to find out, and neither would you. But someone else had heard her judgment. Someone else, already breaking apart in silence, had driven for hours that night with tears in her eyes and bitterness in her throat. She had once lived in that very flat, had been raised in that household, had sat at that same table years before, feeling just as judged. And when she arrived at Eleanor's door, unexpected, uninvited, unraveling, she wasn't there for tea or lectures or even comfort. She was there because she had nowhere else to go. And Eleanor, in her infinite precision, had no room for chaos. A curious side fact: in traditional Japanese homes, there's a concept called me, the empty space between things, a kind of sacred silence. Westerners often mistake it for awkwardness, but sometimes that space says more than any dialogue ever could. There was ma at that lunch, a lot of it, and it swallowed both of you whole. The thing about crime scenes, real ones, is they rarely look like what you've seen on TV. There's no dramatic music, no perfectly placed spotlight over the body. It's just quiet, smells wrong, feels worse, and the one in Eleanor Wakefield's flat, it was all of that. But with an extra layer of dissonance because it looked so ordinary. Books stacked just so, curtains neatly tied, a cup of tea, long cold, still sitting on the windowsill. She might have been working on a chapter when it happened, the pen still resting on a page of notes written in that beautiful, slanted cursive she used when thinking hard. Her desk lamp was on. Her slippers were perfectly placed beneath her chair. It could have been a cozy scene until you looked closer, until you saw the blood. It had pooled beneath her like spilled ink, rich, dark, and too much. It stained the edge of her writing desk and soaked into that Persian rug she'd shipped from Istanbul back in the 70s. The sight of her hunched at her desk, forehead split, shoulders slumped, made the air feel thinner. She hadn't seen it coming. That much was clear. The weapon, a gavel, lay not far from her hand, caked in blood and bits of hair. It had been used with force, more than once. Not a tap of anger, a frenzy, a release. But there was something else, something stranger. Her other hand was clenched tightly. Too tightly. A young constable had to pry her fingers open gently. Inside, barely noticeable, was a single strand of hair. Long, dark, definitely not hers. Eleanor's hair was silver white and tightly curled. This strand was nearly black and straight, and according to the forensic team, freshly torn at the root. Then there was the refrigerator. Why check there? Well, oddly, the door was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had opened it in the middle of something and never closed it again. On the handle was a fingerprint, smudged, reddish. They swabbed for blood, and they tested everything. Your prints were all over the flat. Obviously, Eleanor had never been precious about privacy, but this reddish print didn't match you. It was smaller, shallower, likely female. The tech sent it for lab analysis, no immediate hits, but the story was forming and fast. The paper seized on the idea of an inside job. No sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. Eleanor's purse was still in its usual place by the fireplace, untouched. Her jewelry hadn't been taken. Her laptop was still on, cursor blinking. Even her latest manuscript, ironically titled The Weight of Legacy, was still open in Word. This wasn't a burglary. It was personal. Someone she knew. Someone she let in. You, of course, were the obvious suspect. Proximity, motive, recent argument, all very tidy. The fact that the forensic evidence didn't directly implicate you, well, that's never stopped public opinion before. You can picture them, neighbors hunched behind curtains, reporters combing through bins, the girl from the pub telling everyone she once saw you arguing with your mom about inheritance or something dramatic. And the kicker, you did own the murder weapon. Or at least, you had. That gavel was yours. You'd left it with Eleanor ages ago, and she'd proudly displayed displayed it on her bookshelf, calling it a relic of your promising days. That made it even worse. The weapon was personal too. The investigation stalled almost immediately. No one could explain the hair, no one could identify the print. You kept insisting you hadn't been up to the flat since lunch the previous day. But when pressed for an alibi, all you had was an empty flat, a sink full of dishes, and a bottle of wine that spoke louder than you could. Weeks passed, then months. The case grew cold, or at least lukewarm. News stories overtook it. A political scandal, a royal birth, a heat wave that melted half of Yorkshire's patience. Eleanor's murder became a trivia question haunting, unresolved, but easily shelved. But some details refused to fade, like the fact that the front door was locked from the inside. That meant the killer either had a key or left before Eleanor died, while she was still conscious enough to lock the door behind them. The latter theory sparked endless speculation. Could she have staggered to the door after being attacked? Could she have known her killer and tried to protect them? Even in death, it wouldn't be the first time a mother made a terrible decision out of love. Forensics also revealed another subtle clue. The gavel bore partial fingerprints but smudged, incomplete, and useless, likely wiped. Someone had tried to clean it, half-heartedly. Curiously, one of Eleanor's desk drawers had been opened and rifled through. Not emptied, just disordered. As if someone had been looking for something specific. Notes, a letter, a will. To this day, no one knows what, if anything, was taken. But that refrigerator, the fingerprint never lied. A fringe forensic theory. You'll love this suggests that the open fridge might signal something deeply human. Hunger after violence. There are documented cases of killers eating immediately after committing a murder, not out of glee, but because adrenaline crashes the system and the body. In chaos, seeks grounding. Historians still argue whether that's science or sensationalism, but it's a detail that never stopped bothering the lead detective. Why open the fridge? What were they looking for? Milk, forgiveness, something colder. The evidence told a story, just not the whole one. And while you crumbled under the weight of suspicion, the real author of this tale was already back in Leeds, putting her children to bed, staring into the mirror, and trying not to see her mother's blood on her hands. The thing about small towns in Lancaster, for all its cathedrals and cobblestones, is still very much one, is that once the whispers start, they rarely stop. It doesn't matter how many facts you throw at them. Whispers don't need evidence. They just need momentum. And in your case, Thomas, they had plenty. At first, it was polite curiosity, the sort of head-tilt pity you get at the post office. Poor lad, must be devastated. Then came the subtle shuffles, people crossing the street when they saw you coming, old colleagues too busy to return your calls. Even your barber stopped asking about your life and just cut your hair in silence. Then, inevitably, came the vitriol. You know, he never recovered from university. I always said there was something off about him, too clever by half. Funny how no one else had a key to her flat, isn't it? Lancaster was building its own mythos, a mother slain in her sanctum, a brilliant son turned bitter, a fall from grace, ending with blood on a Persian rug. They didn't need resolution, they just needed drama. And you fit the part. Even your queerness became part of the narrative. Though no one would say it outright. They used words like troubled and secretive. They said you'd always been dramatic. You'd once told a friend that being gay in the legal field in the early 80s was like trying to ice skate uphill in a trench coat. And they laughed, sure, but later, that became code. Something unwholesome to the town's self-appointed moral historians. Your former friends were no better. They wanted to help, but none of them wanted the headlines that came with it. Association with a murder suspect wasn't great for networking. So, you withdrew, and while you watched your reputation dissolve like sugar in hot tea, the real horror wasn't what people were saying. It was what they were not saying. No one asked if you were okay. No one wondered if maybe Eleanor had been difficult. No one looked at your situation and saw anything other than a tidy tragedy. You were grieving a mother who was never warm, never easy, and now never coming back. And if people had been paying attention, they might have noticed that this wasn't your first time playing scapegoat in the Wakefield household. The first time had been when you were 10, a vase smashed, a lie told, and Isabel, sweet, scared Isabel, had blamed you. Eleanor had believed her instantly. That memory came back sharper now, didn't it? The Wakefields had always held themselves above emotion, discipline over drama. Silence over sentiment. Eleanor often quoted Marcus Aurelius at breakfast because nothing says good morning like Roman stoicism. Her expectations were exacting, her punishments subtle. A withdrawal of affection, a cold nod, a weekend without books. You learned quickly how to perform. Isabel didn't. She was adopted. Of course, everyone knew that. A quiet, curly-haired girl from a northern agency, brought in after Eleanor's second miscarriage. At first, she was cherished, photographed, doted on, given the nickname Little Owl for her wide-eyed stares and love of bedtime stories. But then you arrived, and you were bright, early speaking, full of confidence. By the time you were both teenagers, the difference in treatment had become a canyon. You got tutors. She got shrugs. You got praise for exams. She got reminders to try harder. Eleanor once said, "She's just not wired for brilliance." Poor thing. And she meant it like an apology to herself. By the time Isabel was 17, she'd already started drifting quietly, resentfully, out of view. And when she left for Leeds, it wasn't with celebration, it was with silence. She met Daniel at university, dropped out, married quickly, had 2 kids in 3 years. You weren't close anymore, barely spoke, really, but you heard things, through your mother, mostly, that Isabel struggled with the children, that her marriage was rocky, that she'd always been fragile. Eleanor didn't believe in fragility, so when Isabel called that day, the day before the murder, Eleanor didn't answer, and when she called again, from a petrol station just outside Lancaster, Eleanor let it ring. By the time Isabel reached the flat, she wasn't just heartbroken, she was done. Still, you had no way of knowing that. None of you did, because she wore her pain like wallpaper, just part of the background. And no one, not Daniel, not Eleanor, not even you, had peeled back the edges to see what was underneath. Here's a strange historical tidbit for you. In ancient Greek theater, the concept of hamartia referred to a tragic flaw, not a villainy, just a misstep. A small error that, when paired with fate, unravels everything. Eleanor's flaw, her pride, yours, your silence, Isabel's. She'll tell you herself eventually. But at this moment in the story, all the town sees is a mother dead, a son disgraced, and a tragedy with a bow on top. Historians still argue whether society failed Thomas Wakefield or whether he was simply too brittle for the world he was born into. Either way, the whispers kept hissing. And you, once Lancaster's favorite son, became its most convenient ghost. You hadn't entered Eleanor's study in months. It wasn't forbidden. Nothing in that flat was really. But there were unspoken territories in the Wakefield world, spaces where history reigned, and emotion was politely asked to wait in the hallway. Eleanor's study was one of those places. She called it the sanctum. It wasn't large, just a square room facing the park, with tall windows and wooden shelves climbing every wall. The air always smelled faintly of parchment, lavender, and old ambition. On one wall hung a faded tapestry she claimed was genuine Tudor, though you always suspected it came from a very convincing antique dealer with a gift for storytelling. After her death, the police swept through the study like archaeologists. They photographed everything, bagged the usual evidence, blood, hair, the gavel, and left the rest undisturbed. Officially, there was nothing remarkable in the room, but unofficially, you knew better, because Eleanor didn't just archive the past, she curated it. In the weeks after the funeral, when the whispers had dulled and your grief had hardened into something quieter, you finally crept back upstairs. You told yourself it was for closure, maybe to find something for the estate, maybe to feel close to her one last time. But mostly, you were chasing answers, even if you didn't know what the questions were yet. The study greeted you with its usual judgmental hush. Dust motes danced in the angled sunlight. Her desk, still the same desk where she died, was clean now, the blood long scrubbed away. But you avoided it anyway. Your eyes went to the bookshelves instead. Volumes lined up with the precision of military regiments, English history, social reform, legal theory. And tucked in between, binders, dozens of them, mismatched, hand-labeled, and color-coded. Some were obvious church histories, 1500, 1700, others less so. Private T.W. Isabel letters, Daniel Leeds. You paused. These weren't just research files, these were dossiers. You pulled the one labeled Isabel letters. Inside were dozens of pages. Some printed emails, some handwritten notes, some old photos, and something else. a folded piece of notebook paper, scrawled in a rushed, slanted hand. Mom, I don't know what you want from me. I'm not Thomas. I don't shine like he does, but I'm still here. Doesn't that count for something? You stared at the note for a long time. You didn't remember Isabel writing it, but the pain in it was familiar. You'd written your own versions once. She just never saw yours. You checked another binder labeled Private T.Ws. And there it was, a detailed timeline of your professional downfall. Press clippings, disciplinary hearing transcripts, notes in Eleanor's handwriting, potential still present, poor impulse control, finances look into budgeting support. You let out a dry laugh. Of course, she turned your breakdown into a research project, but there was something else. A printed email chain between her and someone with a Leeds address. Daniel Harper. You hadn't thought about Daniel in years. Isabel's husband. A man who always seemed too slick by half smart, charming. The kind of person who smiled at waitstaff but never tipped. He and Eleanor had never liked each other. That much you remembered clearly. You read the exchange. Dear Eleanor, you have no right to intervene in my family's affairs. Isabel is my wife. What we go through is none of your business. Eleanor's reply, as always, was surgical. Daniel, you married a woman already crumbling. If you can't support her, perhaps don't pretend you know how to lead a household. I won't watch another Wakefield fall into ruin under a man's ego. Charming. You closed the binder and stepped back. Eleanor had been many things: scholar, critic, matriarch. But above all, she'd been an observer, and she'd been watching Isabel more closely than anyone knew. Not out of love, not quite, but out of something colder, something more clinical. You walked to the fireplace and looked up at the mantel. There, tucked behind a photo of the two of you at your graduation, was a small brass key, the kind Eleanor always said was for emergencies. You pocketed it, no idea why, maybe just instinct. That night, you couldn't sleep, because it was starting to take shape. The idea that Eleanor hadn't just been murdered. She'd been building the preface to her own ending for years. A weird historical fact here. In Victorian England, some people commissioned their own posthumous memoirs. They'd keep journals not for themselves, but for future biographers, carefully curated narratives. It's called legacy crafting. Eleanor Wakefield has done one better. She'd written everyone's biography except her own. Historians still argue whether she did it out of love, control, or sheer academic curiosity. But one thing's certain, Eleanor never saw her children as equals, only subjects. And one of those subjects had snapped. You were never supposed to be the only Wakefield. Back in the early days, when the family name still glowed with possibility and your mother still smiled in photographs, Isabel was the centerpiece. She came first not in birth order, but in Eleanor's plan, she was adopted. Yes, but that never seemed to matter at first. Eleanor and her husband, fresh from the grief of a second miscarriage, had walked into the agency with high collars and high hopes. They didn't want just any child, they wanted one with potential. And Isabel, with her curious eyes and quiet grace, seemed like a blank canvas on which they could paint their perfect legacy. At least, that was the idea. You remember flashes from childhood Isabel with a magnifying glass? Studying insects in the garden. Isabel curled on the carpet, drawing elaborate maps of imaginary kingdoms. Isabel hiding under the staircase during storms, not out of fear, but because she liked the sound of thunder when it echoed through the wood. She was soft-spoken, observant, and patient. She was never what Eleanor expected. Eleanor wanted prodigies. Isabel was introspective, thoughtful, yes, but not fast. She needed time to learn. She asked too many why questions and not enough how. At school, she was fine but not exceptional, not like you. And that's when things started to shift. The praise that had once belonged to her slowly turned toward you. At first, she tried to keep up. She started piano lessons, read books beyond her age level, even joined the school debate club, despite a fear of public speaking. So bad she once threw up before a class presentation. But the more she tried, the more she faltered. Eleanor didn't scold her. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she dismissed her with softness. She's just not academic. She'd say, more creative. I think a different kind of intelligence. The kind that didn't win scholarships. At the time, You didn't notice. You were too busy shining. Trophies, certificates, debate wins, all while Isabel quietly began to fade. By your teens, the distance was complete. You had your friends, your goals, your mother's unyielding attention. Isabel. She had her bedroom, her books, and a growing sadness that no one named directly. Then came Daniel. He was new to the sixth form, older, worldly, with a grin that made teachers nervous. Isabel fell fast. You remember seeing them together and feeling something strange in your chest, not jealousy, exactly, but concern. He was all sharp edges and casual cruelty, but she clung to him like a lifeline. Eleanor hated him from the start, called him an opportunist after meeting him once. She even tried to forbid the relationship, which only made Isabel dig in deeper. At 19, Isabel moved to Leeds with him. A year later, they were married. Then came the babies, 2 girls, in quick succession. You lost touch around that time, not deliberately, just gradually. You were busy climbing ladders, building cases, pretending your life was perfect. She was drowning in nappies and postpartum fog, trying to find herself in a house that didn't feel like hers. Eleanor, meanwhile, gave her version of events to anyone who'd listen. Isabel's always been sensitive. She never really adjusted to adult life. Some people just aren't built for pressure. What she never said, what none of you said, was that Isabel had been unraveling for years, and no one had asked why. You hear stories now, in retrospect, from old friends, from Daniel's colleagues, stories about Isabel sitting alone in her car after grocery shopping, staring into the middle distance for hours, about the time she forgot to pick up her daughter from school twice in 1 week, about the way she stopped answering phone calls and started leaving the television on all night just for the noise. She was exhausted, emotionally starved, and, most dangerously of all, invisible. Postpartum depression, especially in the 1980s, was rarely named, and even more rarely treated. It was seen as weakness, a failure of character, something women were expected to overcome with a good night's sleep and a better attitude. Isabel didn't overcome it. She buried it. And when Daniel began having an affair, yes, that came out later, something in her cracked. She called Eleanor repeatedly. No answer. She left voicemails. No reply. So she drove 3 hours with nothing but a small overnight bag, an empty thermos, and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Historians still argue whether Eleanor had any idea what was coming when Isabel knocked on the door that night, whether she sensed the desperation behind her daughter's forced smile, whether she saw the glint of something sharp in her eyes and chose, once again, to pretend it wasn't there. But here's something strange, something only someone like Eleanor would have appreciated. In certain branches of folklore, adopted children were thought to be changelings, mystical substitutes, left by fairies in place of the real child. It's absurd, of course, cruel. But Eleanor, with her fascination for cultural myths, had once written an article on that very theme. She never applied it to Isabel, but you wonder, now, if she ever thought it. Because in that final moment when Isabel stood before her, broken, trembling, needing her mother more than ever, Eleanor didn't reach out, didn't offer tea or shelter or grace. She offered judgment, and Isabel, after a lifetime of being not enough, finally broke. It begins in silence. Isabel doesn't slam the door when she arrives. She doesn't storm in, wild-eyed and screaming. She simply stands there for a long time, staring at the varnished wood, her knuckles hovering an inch from the knocker. You can almost feel her breath fogging in the cool night air. Her cheeks are raw from crying, or maybe just from the drive. Her car is parked badly crooked, 2 wheels on the curb, but she doesn't notice or care. It's nearly midnight in Lancaster. The streets are empty, the curtains drawn. The only light on in the building is from Eleanor's study. Isabel sees it flickering through the drapes and thinks, good. She's awake. She knocks once, lightly. Eleanor opens the door with her usual cool expression, one that says, I wasn't expecting you, but I'm not surprised either. There's always that performance in Eleanor, like she's living in a play only she knows the script to. Isabel, she says, folding her arms. It's very late. I know. Isabel's voice cracks. Can I come in? Eleanor studies at her for a moment, then steps aside. The flat is warm and smells like dust and sandalwood. Isabel stands in the entryway, dripping night air, Feeling like a teenager again, like she's about to get scolded for forgetting her Latin homework, she starts talking almost immediately about Daniel, about the affair, about the way he looked at her last week like she was already gone, about the girls, how she loves them so much it hurts. But lately, even holding them feels like trying to lift her own reflection. She talks, and Eleanor listens, sorta, because Eleanor isn't nodding, isn't reaching for tea. She's standing with that same stony expression, her brow creased not in sympathy but in calculation. And finally, she speaks. "I warned you about him." Isabel flinches. "I know you did. You said you knew better. You married him anyway. You had children before you were ready. And now what? You want me to fix it?" "No," Isabel whispers. "I just wanted someone to tell me I'm not a failure." There's a pause, a long one. Eleanor walks to her desk, adjusts a paperweight, doesn't look at her. "You've always had a flair for drama," she says. "But you were never built for chaos. You crumble the moment life gets hard." That's when Isabel feels it. The snap. Not all at once. Not like a scream or a sudden blow. More like a slow, internal splintering. Like a branch weighed down by too many winters finally giving way. She doesn't cry. Instead, she notices something odd. The gavel on the shelf. The one from Thomas's prosecutorial days. Heavy, walnut wood. A strange object for Eleanor to keep so close at hand, especially after the way things ended with Thomas. But Eleanor always liked symbols. Isabel reaches for it, just to touch something solid, something real, something that once meant justice. "What are you doing?" Eleanor's voice sharpens. Isabel doesn't answer. She turns the gavel in her hand. It's heavier than it looks. Cool. Perfectly balanced. She wonders what Thomas felt, holding it in court, using it to end other people's stories. And suddenly, she's seeing red. Not anger, not fire, but shame. Years of it. Being the afterthought. The quiet one. The mistake that came before the masterpiece. Being held up against Thomas like a mirror with no reflection. She hears Eleanor say something else. Something like, "Put that down, Isabel," but her ears are ringing. Her arms are trembling. Her eyes are burning. "I just wanted you to see me," Isabel says, softly. And then she swings. Once, twice, 3 times. She doesn't count, doesn't plan, doesn't breathe. And when she stops, Eleanor is slumped over her desk. The pen she'd been holding still clutched between her fingers. Her mouth is slightly open, like she'd been trying to speak or scream. Isabel drops the gavel. Silence again. The kind that presses into your skin. She stands there, swaying, her breath ragged. Her mother's blood is on her sleeve, her knuckles, even the edge of her shoe. There's a smear of it on the fridge. She remembers reaching for it, thinking she needed water, something to ground her. She opens the door, stares blankly at the bottles and containers, then closes it without taking anything. She notices a strand of her hair clinging to Eleanor's sleeve, tries to pull it free, fails, leaves it. Her hands shake as she wipes them on a dish towel and drops it in the sink. Then she walks out, locks the door behind her, drives 3 hours back to Leeds in silence. She doesn't turn on the radio, doesn't stop for petrol, though she's nearly empty, doesn't cry. She just drives, one hand on the wheel, the other clenched in her lap. The next morning, she makes her daughter's breakfast, scrambles eggs with too much salt, kisses their foreheads, pretends she didn't kill the only woman who ever made her feel small enough to vanish. Quirky detail here. In medieval England, women accused of killing family members were often buried at crossroads, an attempt to confuse the soul and prevent it from haunting anyone. Not that anyone does that anymore. Still, you wonder, where do you bury guilt that never quite dies? Historians still argue whether Isabel's act was premeditated or impulsive, whether she snapped in the moment or had been walking toward it for years. But one thing's clear, she didn't expect to be caught. Not for a very long time. You never noticed the gavel was missing? When the police returned your personal belongings after closing the initial phase of the investigation, they handed over your watch, a few books from Eleanor's shelves you'd lent her, and a typed receipt for the ceremonial gavel, now tagged as evidence. You held the slip for a moment, staring at it like it might explain something, but it didn't. It was just a line item. Object, wooden gavel. Owner, Thomas Wakefield. Status, in possession of forensics. Lancashire Police. You hadn't touched it in years. It had been a gift from your first legal team after the Hopkins case. A complicated fraud trial that made national news and cemented your reputation. You used to joke that it was your Excalibur, the symbol of a life you once had, where your voice held power and your name carried weight. When Eleanor asked to borrow it for an exhibit, she said you didn't hesitate, and then you forgot about it until it returned, smeared in blood. They showed you photos. Of course they did. That was protocol. You had to confirm it was yours, and you did, without flinching. Because what else could you do? There it was, your initials engraved on the handle, the brass plate, the fine walnut grain, dulled by time and now by something else entirely. You signed the form and walked home, colder than you'd ever felt. But let's rewind, because back in Leeds, on the night of the murder, Isabel didn't return to Daniel with a confession. She returned with silence. And Daniel, sharp-eyed as he was, noticed something was off. "Did you get lost?" he asked when she walked through the door. Coat still damp, hands trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she kissed their daughters goodnight, changed into pajamas, made tea she didn't drink, then sat in the living room staring at a blank TV screen while Daniel watched her from the hallway, his instincts prickling. He didn't press. Not that night. But over the following days, he began to piece things together. The news broke quickly. Local historian found dead in Lancaster home. No suspects, no arrests. Foul play suspected. The usual polite language used when a pillar of the community has been murdered and the police have nothing concrete. Isabel barely reacted. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She didn't attend the funeral. She said she was too tired. Daniel had his suspicions. Of course he did. They'd been growing apart for months, maybe years. He'd seen her disappear into herself after the births. He'd watched her forget names, appointments, even conversations. But this silence felt different. And then came the night she sleep-talked. He was awake, working in the study, when he heard it, her voice, low and strained, drifting through the thin bedroom walls. "I didn't mean to." She wouldn't stop. She just kept... He paused, stood up, walked slowly to the door. "I just wanted her to say she saw me." The next morning, Isabel had no memory of the words, but Daniel did. He began keeping a journal, notes, times, phrases. And then, months later, during a bitter custody argument, one that threatened to sever him from his daughters entirely, he made a decision. He asked her to talk, just talk. "For closure," he said, "for therapy." He recorded it, illegally. In it, Isabel doesn't confess all at once, but she unravels. You can hear her sipping wine, hear her breath hitch. "She said I'd never be enough," she murmurs at one point, "and I believed her. I believed her for so long. It became the only thing I could hear." Daniel asks what happened in Lancaster, and Isabel, tired, wine warm, and bitter, tells him, not in perfect detail, not with clarity, but enough. She mentions the gavel, the fridge, the blood, and her voice breaks when she says, "I didn't plan it. I didn't even shout. I just stopped being invisible." He sends the tape to the police 2 days later, and just like that, the case is reborn. "You're already gone. I then passed from this world and its cruelties. But your name is mentioned in every headline, in every article. Son wrongly blamed. Family tragedy, deeper than suspected. Some say the ghost of Thomas Wakefield haunts the old Wakefield flats, pacing the space between floors, muttering the verdicts he never got to speak." But the truth is simpler. The case, once murky, was now clear. Isabel Wakefield was arrested in the early hours of a rainy September morning. Her daughters were asleep. She didn't resist. She barely even asked why. A fringe legal historian, because of course, that's a thing, once wrote that gavels were originally symbolic weapons, blunt, heavy instruments that delivered not just judgment, but silence. Eleanor's had done both. Historians still argue whether Isabel's confession was an act of justice or desperation, whether she truly wanted to be caught or whether Daniel forced her hand. But one thing everyone agrees on: there's no gavel strong enough to undo what was done. You imagine the moment like this: Isabel sitting alone in the interview room, hands folded in her lap, the fluorescent light buzzing softly overhead. She looks smaller than you remember, older, certainly, but not in a way that suggests age. In a way that suggests erosion, like someone who's been quietly chipped away by decades of cold weather and colder words. Across from her, 2 detectives, one silent, taking notes, the other watching her with a kind of hesitant patience, like he's handling a cracked porcelain vase with a bomb inside it. They play the tape. She listens. She doesn't ask them to turn it off, doesn't deny it, doesn't cry, just waits until the end. Then says, quietly, "Do I get to see my girls before I go? You were gone by then. Dead 2 years. But if you had been alive, you probably would have watched it unfold on the telly like everyone else." The reporters staking out the Wakefield flats again. The old gossip mill spinning back to life. New phrases creeping into the headlines now: Wakefield dynasty, family of secrets, second-degree confession. Isabel didn't fight the charges. Her lawyer pushed for leniency, cited her fragile mental state, her untreated depression, her history of emotional neglect. The prosecutor argued she had options, and none of them included murder. The case went to trial, but it wasn't the circus some expected. Isabel refused to testify, refused to speak at all. Really, beyond what was necessary, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. No elaborate defense, no media tour, just a few days of courtroom silence, interrupted only by the occasional gasp when the details got too real. And there were details: the blood spatter analysis, the forensic psychologist's report on suppressed rage, the way Eleanor's desk had been left perfectly intact, papers not even scattered, as if the act of killing her had been precise, targeted, personal. And then there was the hair, the one clutched in Eleanor's hand, the one no one could identify, until the DNA results confirmed it. Isabel's. It's strange to think about, isn't it? That something so small, so light and delicate could carry the weight of a whole crime. One strand, one tremble of regret left behind. The fridge fingerprint matched too. She had left her mark in every sense of the word. When the judge read the sentence, 20 years with eligibility for parole after 10, Isabel didn't flinch. She nodded once, almost like she was relieved. You picture her walking out of the courtroom, wrists in cuffs, eyes steady, and you wonder, was it guilt that drove her silence? Or grief? Or maybe, finally, peace? Because that's the thing no one talks about, how sometimes the act of destroying something is also a final attempt to be seen. And Eleanor had never seen her. Not truly. Not as a daughter. Not as a person. Only as a deviation from the legacy she was building. A quirky historical tangent here. In the late 1800s, a British psychologist named Henry Maudsley wrote about what he called hereditary moral insanity, a wildly problematic concept now, but one that tried to explain why some children simply could not live up to their family's standards because they were, as he saw it, wired to fail. Critics later rejected the idea, but you'd be surprised how many parents secretly bought into it anyway. Eleanor, had she read Maudsley? And let's be honest, she had probably disagreed. She didn't think Isabel was mad, just disappointing. And in the end, Isabel proved her wrong in the only way she knew how. Years passed. Isabel served 11 of her 20 years. She was released early for good behavior, on the condition that she remain under supervision and never leave the country without permission. She moved to a small town outside York, changed her surname, worked part-time at a florist. Her daughters visited occasionally, tentatively, grown now, with families of their own. They carried their own version of the story, their own scars. They never spoke of the night in Lancaster, but sometimes they asked her to tell them stories about when she was little, about Eleanor, about you, and she did. She told them about the garden at the Wakefield home, and how she used to draw pictures of fairies under the ivy. She told them about the time you tried to build a time machine out of coat hangers and got electrocuted by the toaster. She told them Eleanor wasn't always cold that once. After Isabel got pneumonia, Eleanor had stayed up 3 nights in a row, spoon-feeding her soup and reciting Chaucer in a whisper. Historians still argue whether Isabel Wakefield was a victim, a villain, or just the collateral damage of a family that mistook legacy for love. But maybe that's the wrong debate. Maybe, in the end, she was just someone who broke quietly, completely after too many years of being the invisible character in someone else's narrative. And when she picked up that gavel, she wasn't delivering judgment. She was writing her own ending. You wouldn't have known the case had reopened. Thomas, not from the quiet sanctuary of the grave, and not from whatever fuzzy silence liver failure delivers. But if you'd been alive, you'd have noticed the shift, the return of phone calls, the apologies too late to matter, the local newspaper's editorial titled, "We owe him an apology," tucked halfway down the page, beneath an article about garden compost regulations because Daniel Harper, the one-time charmer, the sleek, side-smiling husband who wore success like an aftershave, had finally spoken up. And, boy, did he speak. It started subtly. A quiet call to the Leeds precinct, stating he had something of interest related to the Wakefield case. No one expected much, some crackpot tip. Maybe, but the detective on duty remembered the file, remembered the unanswered questions, so they listened. And when Daniel handed over the tape, a digital file, crackling slightly, as if even the audio felt guilty, everything changed. On it, you hear a man cooing gently, soft with manipulation. "You can tell me, Izzy. You know you can. No one's listening." Then her voice, too soft at first, blurred by wine and distance. She said I was weak, that I'd always been weak. I didn't even mean to pick it up. It was just there. There's a pause, a sob. I didn't mean to, but I did. I did it. It's not the kind of confession that wins awards for clarity. But it didn't need to. With the fingerprint match, the hair DNA, and now this raw, tired, and emotionally unfiltered, it was enough. Daniel hadn't turned over the tape out of moral clarity. No, he was in the middle of a vicious custody battle. Isabel had tried to fight for full parental rights after years of separation. And Daniel, never one to lose, had dug through old files like a dog chasing inheritance. What he found wasn't a weapon, it was a time bomb. He claimed he'd recorded it for safety reasons, that she had made concerning statements, but the timing was too perfect, too sharp-edged. And when asked why he hadn't come forward earlier, he said, "She's their mother. I didn't want to destroy her, but I also couldn't let her take them." Noble, if you squint. Vindictive, if you don't. The police took the tape. They verified the audio, had voice analysts confirm the speakers, had lip readers examine accompanying video because, yes, Daniel had apparently filmed part of it too, just never admitted that up front. And then they reopened the case. The media pounced like they were starved. The Wakefield case became a story again, no longer a tragic mystery, but a twisted morality play. Daughter's secret confession exposes decades of family decay, wrongly accused. Son died under stigma. You became a posthumous martyr. Eleanor, a cautionary tale of cold ambition. And Isabel, a paradox. People wanted to feel sorry for her, sort of, but not too much. It was easier to say she snapped. That pressure had gotten to her. That being the invisible sibling had pushed her into madness. But that wasn't it, was it? You'd both grown up under pressure. But where you rebelled, drank, shouted, collapsed in public, she imploded. And when she finally did explode, it was in silence. Precision. Almost grace. The prosecution made no spectacle. They presented the tape, the physical evidence. They pulled out her journals, ones they'd subpoenaed from Daniel's attic. Writings filled with longings for validation, notes about the feeling of fading. One entry read, "I used to dream she would call me by name and mean it. Not just Isabel, like it was a smudge on the tablecloth, but me, the daughter, the person." The defense leaned hard into mental health, postpartum depression, chronic emotional neglect, the weight of a legacy never designed for her shoulders. They presented a profile not of a killer, but of a cracked vase, one that had been dropped too many times to hold anything anymore. The courtroom watched her with a mix of horror and sorrow. The sentence was lenient, as these things go. 20 years, out in 11. Some said justice was done. Others said it was far too little, far too late. But one strange thing stuck in everyone's mind, something small, easily overlooked. In the courtroom, as the judge read out the sentence, Isabel never cried, never shook, but she did mouth two words to herself, "I'm sorry." Not to the court, not to Daniel, but maybe to you, because she hadn't meant for you to suffer. She'd seen the headlines after Eleanor's death, the suspicion, the shame, the slow unraveling of your life. And she said nothing. Not when the case went cold, not when you died. She let the silence do the damage, and in her way, that haunted her just as much as the act itself. Weird fact. In 17th century England, it was considered a sin not only to bear false witness, but to withhold truth that could save an innocent. Silence, in legal terms, was a form of moral guilt. Historians still argue whether Daniel was the true villain profiting off a confession, manipulating justice for custody. But justice, in the end, doesn't operate in clean lines. It's messy, It's human. It lives in the space between guilt and grief. And in the end, it wasn't law that cracked this case open. It was a whisper on a recording. Proof that what breaks us doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sighs. You're not in the courtroom. Of course, not physically. You're ashes or bones or some quiet wisp in the corners of that old Wakefield building. But your presence lingers there undeniably, uncomfortably. Like the creak in an old wooden pew during a moment of silence. Because on the first day of the Crown versus Isabel Wakefield, they mention you before they even mention the murder weapon. Thomas Wakefield, deceased, was the victim of both public suspicion and familial abandonment in the wake of Eleanor Wakefield's death. New evidence proves he was not involved. You become a symbol, a warning, a shadow over the proceedings. People shift in their seats when your name is read aloud. Reporters scribble, jurors frown, even the judge glances down, his mouth tightening ever so slightly. You're the son they ruined, the scapegoat turned martyr. And while you can't sit there in your pressed court suit and deliver a blistering summation, your story unfolds anyway through records, through photos, through a handful of awkward, belated apologies delivered like wilted flowers to your memory. They show your academic records. Your courtroom wins. They show the photo of you and Eleanor from your university graduation, the one where you're smiling too hard and she's not smiling at all. They play a clip of your television appearance from years ago. That segment on legal ethics where you quote Cicero and the audience claps like you said something revolutionary. And then they show the decline. The notes from your disciplinary hearing, the letter you wrote to Eleanor after your suspension never mailed, found in your desk drawer after your death. Mom, I know I've disappointed you, but I'm still trying. I swear I'm trying. That one hits the room like a dropped book. Then comes the star witness, Daniel Harper. He takes the stand with the precision of a man who's been rehearsing for months. Clean suit, modest tie, the posture of someone who wants to be taken seriously but not too seriously. He plays the tape. The courtroom listens in near total silence, broken only by Isabel's quiet breathing. Some people cry, not because the confession is graphic, but because it isn't. It's raw, tired. The sound of someone emptying out a truth they never meant to carry. I didn't go there to hurt her. I just wanted her to understand, to hold me, to see me. When it ends, Daniel is asked why he didn't report it sooner. He sighs, looks down. I thought I was protecting our daughters. I realize now, I might have been protecting myself. He steps down. Some people believe him, some don't. Then it's the psychologists. The doctors describe Isabel's mental health with language sharp enough to cut: postpartum depression, prolonged emotional neglect, identity suppression, a lifetime of what one expert calls existential erasure. Another expert describes it as a house built without doors. No escape from the self. They say she wasn't psychotic. She knew what she was doing, but they also say she was operating in what's called a compressed dissociative state, something between numbness and rage, where the body moves before the mind can catch up. It doesn't excuse the act, but it explains it. Then come the closing arguments. The prosecution keeps it simple. A woman entered her mother's home and struck her with a weapon multiple times. She fled. She remained silent. An innocent man, her brother, took the fall and died under that weight. The defense leans on sympathy. She was failed over and over by her mother, by her husband, by the world. This does not make her innocent, but it makes her human. The jury deliberates for less than 2 hours. Second-degree murder. Guilty. The sentence, 20 years. Eligible for parole after 10. You wonder, if you were there, whether you would have clapped, or stood, or simply walked out in silence. Because it doesn't feel like justice. Exactly. More like the least worst outcome. Isabel doesn't cry out the verdict, but she does turn, briefly, to the gallery, where her daughters sit. They're grown now. Neither smiles, neither leaves. They just watch, and you hovering at the edges of this whole mess. Whether in memory or myth, feel something strange. Not peace, but clarity. Like the story has finally, painfully, landed. Interesting note. In ancient Roman trials, the term vindicta referred not just to vengeance, but to a ceremonial rod used to grant freedom to a slave, a strange object, one that symbolized release, not punishment. Your gavel was never meant to do what it did, but in its own twisted way, maybe it granted freedom after all. Historians still argue whether the Wakefield case was a tragedy, a cautionary tale, or simply the natural consequence of too many silences. But from the back row of history, one thing is clear: everyone left the courtroom changed, even the ghosts. There's a photograph tucked away in one of Eleanor's old scrapbooks, a grainy, sun-washed image of you and Thomas sitting on the garden wall, legs dangling, hair wind-whipped. You're both laughing, real laughter, the kind with squinted eyes and crooked teeth, and no idea what the world will eventually do to either of you. Thomas would have been about 12 then. You, maybe 8. And Eleanor. She's behind the camera. Her handwriting on this back reads, "The clever one and the quiet one. Summer 1974. You wonder if she'd written the loved one and the unloved one, whether things would have been easier. At least it would have been honest. Because for all the headlines, for all the drama and courtroom drama and whispers in the street, the saddest part of this story isn't the murder, it is the years leading up to it. The slow, aching decay of a boy who spent his whole life proving something, only to find out he was playing to an audience that didn't clap. Not really. Not unless he was winning. Not unless he was perfect. The tabloids had loved Thomas when he was young. North Yorkshire's rising star. Boy wonder of the bench. But when his fall came, they circled like vultures. Drinking, depression, professional misconduct. Then, after Eleanor's death, the real poison. Prime suspect, never charged, never arrested, but always mentioned. You watched him fold in on himself, slowly, like a houseplant in a too dark room, stopped attending functions, avoided the pub, didn't return calls, let the beard grow out, the apartment rot. A man who had once debated legal theory with Oxford dons was now debating expiration dates on milk cartons. And when his liver finally gave out, no one said the word suicide, but they didn't need to. His funeral was small, rainy, uneventful. You and the vicar and 2 of his old mates from Durham, neither of whom stayed long afterward. You remember the casket looking smaller than it should have, like there was less of him than there used to be. Eleanor wasn't there. Of course, she'd already been gone 2 years, but her absence was the loudest thing in the room. There was no grand eulogy, no tearful tributes, just a muttered prayer and some awkward shuffling of coats. You had to hold the umbrella over the grave yourself, and even the rain felt like it was avoiding him. Back then, no one knew the truth. The real killer was still shopping for baby clothes and trying not to unravel. The case was considered cold. And Thomas, well, most people had made up their minds. He had motive, he had opportunity, and he had a bottle collection that looked suspiciously like regret. And now he's a cautionary tale. The tragic brother, the wrongly accused, the Shakespearean hero who died just before the final act. The same newspapers that once crucified him now praise him. Wakefield victim of public misjudgment. Truth emerges too late for disgraced prodigy. They print his graduation photo beside headlines about Isabel's sentencing. But there's no real justice in that, is there? It is just cleanup. There's a plaque now, 2, at the Lancaster Legal Institute, in memory of Thomas Wakefield, who reminded us that the law must seek truth, even when it's inconvenient. You wonder what he'd think of that. Probably roll his eyes. Make a dry joke about how statues are just apologies carved in stone. Funny side note. In some parts of the world, it's believed that the dead can't rest until their name is cleared. That their spirit wanders not out of vengeance, but out of unfinished business. If that's true, then maybe Thomas can rest now. Maybe he's not pacing the floorboards of Eleanor's flat anymore, whispering old arguments into the wallpaper. Maybe he's found peace, or at least a quieter kind of waiting. Historians still argue whether public perception killed Thomas Wakefield more than his own liver did, whether the real crime wasn't committed with a gavel, but with 1,000 unchecked assumptions. But there's something beautiful, in a bleak kind of way, about the way his name finally broke free. Not with fanfare, but with quiet, undeniable truth. They can't undo what they did to him, but they can remember. And that, sometimes, is all that's left. And so now, we're here. The case is over, the family scattered, the papers yellowing under the weight of their own headlines. And what remains? Not justice. Not really. Not revenge or redemption, or any of the clean little endings we like to see in courtroom dramas. Just the echoes. You walk past the Wakefield flats now, and they look the same. ivy creeping along the brick, the top floor windows still catching the afternoon sun. You wouldn't know what happened there unless you knew. A ghost lives on the second floor, but only metaphorically now. The blood has long since been scrubbed away, the writing desk sold at auction. Even the Persian rug has vanished, maybe into storage, maybe into someone's living room, where it holds its secrets under the coffee table. Isabel still lives quietly in Yorkshire. She doesn't talk about what happened. She works with flowers, watering, arranging, trying to build beauty from silence. Her daughters visit. Sometimes they talk about the future more than the past. That's a kind of healing too. And Eleanor, well, she's a name on a headstone now. A legacy in the brittle spines of books that gather dust in second-hand shops. Some of her work is still quoted in university papers. Her early writings on Tudor succession are still respected, but even her brilliance, so carefully polished, has dulled with time. You wonder what she'd think of all this, of how her family name now conjures tragedy more than scholarship, of how her own daughter rewrote the final chapter in blood, of how her son, brilliant, broken. Thomas was remembered not for the lives he defended, but for the one he couldn't save. You can't rewrite the past, but you can listen to it. And if this story teaches you anything, it's that the real damage isn't always done with weapons. Sometimes it's done with words never spoken, with truths avoided, with expectations that feel more like chains. Here's something strange to tuck into your dreams tonight. In 14th century Europe, there was a brief period when families would hire professional mourners, strangers who would show up at funerals to cry loudly, publicly, theatrically. The louder the wailing, the more honor the deceased was believed to have earned. It wasn't about grief, it was about appearances. Sound familiar? The Wakefields never hired mourners, but maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they left behind enough noise of their own. Historians still argue whether this case was about mental illness, family dysfunction, or the brittle demands of legacy. Whether Eleanor's murder was inevitable or a cosmic accident born of too many closed doors. But here's what you know now. Sometimes the past doesn't want to be understood. It just wants to be heard. And you've done that. You've sat with the discomfort. You've listened to the silences between the sentences. You've walked through every room of that haunted story and lit a candle in each. So now, let it rest. Let them rest. And you, let yourself drift. Let your breath soften. Let your thoughts quiet down like the final footfalls on an old wooden staircase. Let the lights in the Wakefield house finally go out, one by one. The rain has stopped now. Somewhere outside your window, you didn't notice when was only that the air feels cooler, cleaner, like something has passed. A storm, or maybe just a long, aching breath. You're still here, curled beneath your blanket, eyes soft, shoulders a little less tense than they were an hour ago. The story has landed gently, carefully, and with the kind of weight that doesn't crush, but settles. There's nothing more to uncover. No more secrets hiding in drawers. No more tapes waiting to be played. Just stillness. Let your thoughts fade like fog from the glass. Imagine the Wakefield building once more, but quieter now. Empty rooms, closed books, a vase of fresh flowers on a windowsill somewhere. Just catching the morning light. No more arguments. No more proving. Just peace. And if the ghosts are still there, they're sleeping too. You can join them. If you'd like, let your breathing slow to the rhythm of a gentle clock. No rush, no questions, only rest. Tomorrow will come, as it always does. But tonight belongs to you, and you are safe.